Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
I am glad to welcome Peter Montgomery, Senior Fellow at Right Wing Watch. You can find his articles primarily on rightwingwatch.org. You can find a lot of his stuff on the religious right and Christian nationalism and all this kind of stuff we're going to be talking about in a minute. Can you tell us, Peter, a little bit, though, before we get started on our conversation, what actually is the mission of Right Wing Watch?
The mission of Right Wing Watch is to monitor and analyze and expose the extremism of the religious right and its political allies. We think they are a threat to fundamental constitutional values and democratic values, and confronting that threat is basically our mission.
As a former evangelical myself, what you just said as an evangelical obviously would be hugely offensive, that you view Christians, and I should say not Christians maybe, but the Christian right. Is that what you're saying? It's not necessarily your garden variety evangelical that you're concerned about?
Sure. Well, I think it's the fundamentalist Christianity or various forms of evangelical Christianity, married to this Christian nationalism and married to this dominionist ideology that this country was founded by and for Christians, and the government should be in the hands of what they would consider the right kind of Christians. There's millions of Christians in America they would not consider, quote, real Christians, or would not be their political allies. So we're talking about a very politicized religious political movement.
And we're seeing that literally right now as we're doing this recording. We've got the potential nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court, and yet it's a minority movement that's punching above its weight, isn't it? Because the majority of Americans, first of all, don't want a judge appointed right now, weeks before the election. That's one thing. And then number two, they actually are in favor of, let's say, Roe versus Wade, which is what they're trying to overturn, and for positive for LGBTQ rights and all that. This minority movement is seeking to overturn all those things. So we're seeing, I think, aren't we, an example of the dangerous aspects of the Christian right?
Absolutely. And we're seeing what we're seeing now, and their power within the Trump administration is really the fruits of a project started decades ago. When Pat Robertson, after his failed presidential bid, he hired Republican operative Ralph Reed to help him create the Christian Coalition. And they had an explicitly stated goal of taking working control of the Republican Party within 10 years, starting from the ground up. And they've been very effective. And so that's why the religious right is such a dominant part of the Republican Party base. It's why they have power, as you said, even though their goals are not supported by most people, but they have tremendous amount of power within the Republican Party. And, they made a deal with Trump to help put him in the White House. And he is making sure that they have, gotten their side of the deal taken care of. And so that's why they're so loyal. They're getting everything they want out of this guy, and they're desperate to keep him in the White House.
It's a Faustian bargain, isn't it? They've made this deal with the devil, in effect. And I said the other day in my chat with Andrew Whitehead, he was the co-author of the book, Taking America Back for God. Yeah. I've kind of switched my position now. I believe that I used to say that evangelicals are being inconsistent with their supposed theology and everything. Actually, I believe they're being consistent with their very toxic system. And so they see Trump as he's a savior figure, he's a strong man, he's a Cyrus, whatever word you want to put in there that they like to talk about. And actually the cruelty is the point now. It seems like, they're just like, hey, screw everybody. We're the minority, but we're in power and we're going to win.
They don't like him in spite of him being a bully. They like him because he's a bully, because he's their strong man. There was all this rhetoric from some of the self-proclaimed prophets and apostles who have rallied around him, that he had this breaker anointing, and Lance Wallnau called him God's chaos candidate because they wanted him to come and break up stuff. And so they delight in the chaos he's causing. It's a feature, not a bug, as they say.
Exactly. And yet, as we say, there's going to be a reckoning. The chickens, well, they are coming home to roost in the evangelical church. People are leaving the church in droves, at least millennials, it seems to be, explicitly because of this rabid Trump support and this sort of Faustian deal, as we say. They're leaving, and where are they replacing them? They're not replacing these younger people. So at some point, what's going to happen? You think it's eventually going to die out? Is this like a last gasp of evangelicalism in America?
I think someone who's sort of a sociologist or religion scholar might be better able to answer that. I mean, I do think that demographically, white evangelicals are shrinking as a percentage of the population, but they've maintained their power because they've been done such a good job of striking fear into people that losing dominance means that their freedom is going to be taken away from them. And so in recent elections, they have turned out at higher rates since they've had a bigger chunk of the electorate than their numbers would deserve otherwise. But they are nervous about young people staying away. And I think you're right. Young people are sick of the marriage of their faith to this right-wing politics, to Trump himself, to anti-gay, anti-LGBT extremism, all of that. I think they're trying to counter it. One of the guys I follow who's part of the Bethel Church crowd and the Pentecostal movement is Sean Foyt, who's a musician who ran for Congress, and he's now running all over the country trying to stir up a new Jesus People movement, because he and other people of his generation got mobilized by the Jesus People movement in the 70s, and they're pinning their hopes on sparking something like that now, which would somehow turn around this falling away that's happened in younger generations. I can't predict how successful they'll be with that.
I've seen him because he was recently in a controversial story, wasn't he? Because he went to where George Floyd was murdered and held a concert, like a worship concert. So that seemed to be like he was just gaining notoriety off the back of this terrible crime, really is what it was, against a black man. And then he was in my hometown. He was working his way down the West Coast, I guess, because I think he went to Seattle and then he went to Portland where we used to live. And he's holding these huge outdoor concerts. Of course, no social distancing, no masks. It's all a big hoax. It's all designed to bring Trump down. I don't know what they say about the coronavirus, but it's some sort of plandemic or something. They're buying into a lot of conspiracy theories too, aren't they?
Absolutely. I mean, the number of, evangelical and Pentecostal preachers who spread the conspiracy theories about the COVID virus is huge. And, Foyt ran for Congress, and he didn't make it through California's primary earlier this year, but then he kind of jumped on this sort of bandwagon of portraying restrictions on public gatherings for churches as religious persecution, which is, all the rage on the right, that kind of rhetoric. And now he really is parachuting into all the cities that have had unrest. And, he would say he's, bringing the light to those cities. I've certainly seen a lot of different attitudes about that from activists on the ground, including local Christians who see that, they're doing this work of trying to build community and figure out ways to confront racism in the community. And he kind of parachutes in and takes over the stage. He's a very good self-promoter. And
he's an opportunist for sure. He's capitalizing on this notoriety.
He was part of the crowd that was in Washington this past weekend for these big religious right events we had on the National Mall.
Yes, I read your article about that. I'd love to talk about that. But I wanted to ask you a question. You've been researching the Christian right for, 20 years? You've been researching and writing it? A couple of decades?
Yeah.
What was it
plus.
20, you've lost count. What was it that led you into this work in the first place? Can you give us kind of a backstory that got you into it in the first place?
Yeah, not to try to make it too long a story. When I was a religious kid, when I was in high school, I spent my teen years on a Bible quiz team in the Brethren in Christ denomination, which is a small kind of offshoot of the Mennonites. And then I went to a Jesuit college, and my freshman year was the year that Ronald Reagan was elected with the help of the moral majority and the sort of newly arrived religious right. And that was the election they really made their influence felt for the first time. And so I was always very keenly aware of that. I grew up in a liberal household in a conservative area. My dad was a union organizer. So I always had this interest in religion and politics. I always hated the vision of the religious right. And I bounced around after college for a few years working in nonprofits, and always kept my eye on People for the American Way, which was started in the wake of that 1980 election. And I had a friend that I knew through church work who was working at People for, and one time I ran into her at a party and said, hey, if there's anything that ever opens up there, let me know.
Me up.
And
Yeah.
2 weeks later, she called and said that one of their writers quit. So
Happy days.
Been affiliated with them in various different capacities for 25 years.
What would you say is kind of your area of real speciality? What do you really enjoy covering? Because I know you write a lot of stuff on the sort of New Apostolic Reformation, guys like Frank Amedia, POTUS Shield, these prophets in air quotes, Seven Mountain Mandate. Is that kind of your wheelhouse, would you say, or do you have other areas of interest?
I would say during the Trump era, I have done a lot on that. Over the years, I have focused a lot on the sort of use of religious liberty as the political frame that the right has done, particularly as part of their opposition to LGBTQ equality. So I've spent a lot of time thinking and writing about those issues and religious liberty. And, the coalitions that this kind of Pentecostal crowd is part of really started gelling more so right after Obama got elected. And so I've been really interested in that right after Obama got elected, there was this whole flurry of new coalition building on the right. And it's where you really saw divisions coming down between, say, the traditional, Southern Baptist fundamentalist folks that were in the religious right political movement and this Pentecostal apostles and prophets, New Apostolic Reformation Dominionist crowd. And they started coming together explicitly in coalition, more explicitly in coalition during the Obama years. Mm-hmm. And so that's when I started paying more attention to them. And then certainly when they started declaring during the 2015 election that Trump had been anointed by God to be president, that's when I really got hooked. At that point. Yeah. And so
you can go down the rabbit hole for sure, can't you?
Absolutely.
That's what happened to me with Rushdoony and Christian Reconstructionism. And once you start down that rabbit hole, you're done, because that leads you into so many other areas. Obviously, Christian homeschooling and Christian legal defense stuff, and the whole Reconstructionist piece, and then the political involvement and how that spun off into, like you say, these offshoots of the charismatic side of it. And oh man, it's just an unbelievable rabbit hole.
It is, and it's huge. I mean, the movement is huge. There's so many pieces of it. There's so many, and there's Right Wing Watch. There's just a few of us, and so we try to keep an eye on folks that we see as important and having political influence. But we can only cover a fraction of the hours and hours and hours every day that's out there in broadcast and video, and that's just grown during COVID because everybody has turned to being online, and so the the amount of content that's being put out by these folks is just astonishing, and it's very tied up with Trump, and it's very tied up with what they see as the spiritual imperative of getting him reelected so that he can continue his divine assignments as they see it, and now, well, we can there's so many things we can talk about. I'll let you steer the conversation.
There's so much.
The death of Ginsburg, the Supreme Court, there's a lot.
There's so much. Yeah, I'm sure. I want to talk about your article on Frank Amedia from POTUS Shield, talking about somehow that God apparently must have put Ruth Bader Ginsburg to death to clear the way for a conservative judge so they could overturn Roe versus Wade and so forth. But I was going to ask you, looking at this history of this apostolic side, I've done a little bit on Seven Mountains Mandate. Obviously, most of the stuff I've done when it comes to Dominion theology, I've tended to focus on Rushdoony, Christian Reconstructionism, and sort of the straight, I guess, dominionist political side. What's this deal with the sort of spiritual warfare element of it? What's the history? Where does that come from in terms of these Seven Mountains Mandate crowd?
Yeah, it comes out of, these sort of intercessory prayer movements that have been going on for a long time. And it really kind of coalesced right around the turn of this century. 1999, 2000 is when people talk about the start of the New Apostolic Reformation. And it's people like Peter Wagner, and it comes out of some of the charismatic churches, the Vineyard Assembly churches. Some of the churches are breakaways from the Assemblies of God, one of the big Pentecostal denominations. And, what you have is, the New Apostolic Reformation is not a denomination, so that it doesn't have that same kind of structure. It's this loose network of self-proclaimed apostles and prophets who offer each other, spiritual covering, which is kind of like, a credential. I'm associated with this guy, so I've got legitimacy. And they have, they really have developed the Seven Mountains theology, this theology of taking dominion. One of the things that is striking about that is that they they not only want to change politics and disciple nations to their religious worldview, they see that part of their imperative is also transforming Christianity itself, because other Christians who aren't like them, who don't believe in that God has reinstituted the power of the prophets and apostles and given them the power to transform the world the way he gave his original apostles the power to do miracles. They think any Christian who doesn't believe that has it wrong. So they want to transform Christianity itself as the way to transform politics. And it's all tied up with their approach to the end of the world, which is also different, from a lot of people think of the religious right having the idea that the rapture is going to happen and where all the evangelicals have disappeared. These guys don't like rapture theology because they think it makes people lazy and counting on God to fix things rather than taking over the world to fix them. So they believe that God comes back not to rescue kind of the defeated Christians, but comes back to a triumphant church. So they believe that by taking dominion and becoming the triumphant church, they're helping bring about the return of Jesus Christ. So that is a very heady recruiting tool, to tell people that's the story you can be a part of. You can actually help bring about the return of Jesus Christ by helping us take dominion. Take dominion until I return is sort of a Bible verse you hear them citing. So it's a powerful narrative that they give people to jump into.
Absolutely. So would you say, are they post-millennial in that sense? Okay, so the view you just articulated, what we call pre-millennial, which is most kind of your garden variety evangelical, isn't it? Where they believe, as you say, that Jesus could suddenly come back. He could come back in 5 minutes. He could come back tomorrow. He could come back next week. We don't know. It's a thief in the night sort of rapture theology. But the post-millennial, the church actually becomes stronger and stronger and sort of takes dominion over society, after which then Christ returns once this is all set up. So are these post-millennialists, these new apostolic reformation types?
Yes, and partly because they don't have a denominational structure, I would say that there's probably a range of specific ideas about exactly how that all unfolds. I think different leaders might stress different things about the end times. So they don't all have kind of one clear story about how it all comes to an end, but they definitely think that their taking dominion is the next thing that needs to happen. And they think that God raised up Trump as part of his plan for this end times revival, so that, there's going to be this they believe that we are in the final generation. And they believe that has been prophesied, that as part of that, there will be a 1 billion soul harvest in the earth. And so they believe that Trump taking office, Trump empowering the right kind of Christians in their point of view, Trump sweeping the Supreme Court of liberal and pro-choice justices is all part of turning America back to God and sparking the religious revival in the U.S. that will help spark a religious revival around the world. And that'll bring in this end times 1 billion soul harvest. So Trump is all connected to that vision of the end times. And the end times that we are in.
Right. So the eschatology is all part of the Trump support. It's not just about his policies necessarily, although that sounds like it's part of it, isn't it? But it's really tied in with the theology of the end times. I remember going back to what you were talking about. You mentioned C. Peter Wagner, one of the key founders, or I guess he says he didn't found the New Apostolic Reformation, but he was instrumental in getting it off the ground, whatever it ended up looking like. But the other two names that I've come across in my research are Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham. So you've got Bill Bright of Campus Crusade, or Cru now, and Lauren Cunningham of Youth with a Mission. And I've read this on like Generals.org, which is the Cindy Jacobs and those kind of those websites, the NAR websites. And she says that somehow there's this story that both Bright and Cunningham independently received this revelation from God about the 7 mountains mandate.
Yes.
And then when they came together, each man was like, oh, I've got amazing revelation to share with you. No, I've got an even better one. And it turns out, according to the story, they were sharing the same thing. And that was the mandate going back to probably even the 70s, I think, when they claim it first started. And I remember, too, reading Conway and Siegelman's Holy Terror, and they talk about this in 1980, where there was a change in their sort of mission philosophy, where instead of trying to reach and evangelize the individual people on the sort of street level, they started going after leaders of countries and top military officials and business people. And that was, I think, sort of this missional change, wasn't it? Where they're saying, no, that's the mountain. We have to be on top of that mountain. If we can get that general, if we can get that politician, that prime minister converted to Christianity, we can transform the nation for Christ. And so there's that different sort of ministry philosophy.
Right. And you see that through Generals International and Cindy Jacobs, who goes around and meets with, high level officials. And you see that right now in Congress and in the administration with this other guy who I've written a lot about, Ralph Drollinger, who has something called Capital Ministries. And so he started in California, but moved to D.C. kind of after the Tea Party wave brought a bunch of right-wing evangelicals into Congress. And he has these weekly Bible studies with members of the House and members of the Senate. And then after Trump and Pence came into office, he set up one for members of Trump's cabinet. He teaches this theology. His whole idea is what you just described about leadership. His whole thing is to Christianize and disciple powerful political leaders. And that's how you can turn the nation. And this is a guy who, he's got access to the very highest levels of power in our government, where he preaches that the Bible mandates that public officials support right-wing policies. And he's got, one of his powerful allies, the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, who has used his office to open doors for Drollinger to set this up in other countries. So it's this, within the U.S., it's really this Christian nationalism, but then it's just, it's also a global view of this dominionism. Yeah, it's pretty remarkable. And the guy who, again, it's a kind of a network, but sort of the successor to Peter Wagner is a California-based apostle and clergyman named Che Ahn. And he was one of the people who was on the mall Saturday with all these other religious right figures. So that sort of shows that within the Trump administration and in the circles of the religious right that support Trump, it's really the breadth from the New Apostolic Reformation, Che Ahn, Cindy Jacobs, Lou Engle crowd, all the way to sort of the more traditional Tony Perkins Family Research Council. And there's overlap. One of the bridges between these movements is Jerry Boykin, who is a former lieutenant general, retired general, was the head of special forces in the U.S. military. And he's now the executive vice president at the Family Research Council, but he's also a member of the leadership council of POTUS Shield. So it's really these groups have been knit together in their political work, even if they don't share all the same theology. It's interesting. Seven Mountains, you talked about the Seven Mountains idea, has really been embraced across the religious right as a rhetorical device. So, you see people who might not agree with NAR's eschatology, and they might not agree with the apostles and the prophets thing, but this language of Seven Mountains dominionism proves as a really useful way to recruit people into political engagement, regardless of the theological details. So that rhetoric has really been embraced across the religious right.
I think you have the same thing with Christian Reconstructionism and R.J. Rushdoony. We talked about this when I was speaking with Michael McVicker, and he said that a lot of people will use his language or talking points. They don't necessarily embrace his whole worldview or philosophy, stoning gay people or incorrigible teens or trying to impose the Old Testament law and all the rest of it. But yet, I think the very notion of dominionism, really that core, I think comes out of most of Rushdoony's writings. And that has been then picked up by, as you say, the charismatic side and the political side, because on paper, those two sides shouldn't have anything to do with each other. When I was an evangelical, we were cessationists, basically. So we didn't believe in the gifts of the Spirit, tongues and miracles and healings and all those kind of things. We didn't think they were active for today. So a lot of the fundamentalists, they're still kind of in that camp. So they shouldn't be associating with the charismatics. But as you say, they've been able to put their differences aside theologically and biblically and come together to sort of achieve these dominionist aims, I think.
Yeah, and the same, you could say the same about prosperity gospel preaching, right? Because there is a lot of evangelicals, a lot of fundamentalists view that as fundamentally heretical teaching.
It is heresy, that's what they say.
And they say that. On the other hand, they're delighted that Trump has Paula White not only as an official spiritual advisor, but, with a White House office that she can use to promote Trump, promote Christian nationalism, and to help them achieve their political aims. And so, I hear a lot of people on the evangelical right complaining about Paula White's theology these days because she has done a great job of keeping a continual flow, keeping the doors at the White House open, keeping a continual flow of pastors and preachers and prophets and apostles through the White House to pray with Trump, to get their pictures, to show the world that they're insiders, to show the world that Trump is, a man of God who's fulfilling his divine mandate. So the goals, the political goals, the dominionist goals really have outweighed theological differences. Kind of in the same way, in some sense, that evangelicals and Catholics stopped trashing each other's theology because they were making common cause politically on the culture war issues. The conservative Catholics and the conservative evangelicals found ways to work together despite their theological differences, and that's really, I think, happened now across the Protestant and evangelical and Pentecostal wings of Christianity in the U.S.
Well, look at these Supreme Court justices. Okay, so Amy Coney Barrett, she's a Catholic, a conservative Catholic. I think both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh were raised or at least nominally Catholic. And I read an article the other day, I don't know if you saw this, but it was basically arguing that, why are there so many Catholics on the Supreme Court? And in theory, as you say, the religious right shouldn't be dealing with Catholics either, because historically they've said Catholicism is heretical and they don't like the Pope and some of the teachings and all the rest of it. But the author of this article, I can't remember where it was, might have been in the Atlantic, said that, well, the real reason actually is because, as you say, they have common cause, but more importantly, Catholic schools like Notre Dame, they're a better, more well-respected law schools than like a Liberty or Regents. You're never going to get a Liberty graduate who's a lawyer on the Supreme Court, at least not right now, but a Notre Dame graduate of that law school, they could be a Catholic. Academically, they're more well-respected. So the political right has said, hey, that's great. We'll take that. If we're going to overturn Roe versus Wade, we don't really care if they're Catholic. We're going to setting our theological disagreements aside, because we're going to achieve overturning Roe versus Wade and denying LGBTQ rights and all the rest of it.
Yeah, it's really interesting because, there is this real long intellectual tradition within Catholicism and within the right wing of Catholicism, of intellectual work around natural law philosophy and natural law theology. And so that kind of undergirds a lot of the right wing legal movement. Leonard Leo of the Federalist Society, who's really a mover and shaker in putting Trump's list of justices together, is really part of this right wing Catholic movement. And Robert George at Princeton University, he's really in some ways he's a conservative Catholic who's sort of the intellectual godfather of a lot of the religious rights, religious liberty strategies. He was a co-author of the Manhattan Declaration in 2009, which sort of framed opposition to marriage equality and abortion as religious liberty issues, and sort of, staking a claim that we will not be forced to bend to this, kind of staking this willingness to be martyrs in opposing. That brought a lot of conservative Catholics and conservative evangelicals together. Again, that was part of that sort of flowering of coalitions after Obama was elected.
And of course, Bill Barr, he's another high-profile Catholic, the Attorney General, and I know he's got connections to Opus Dei. He denies it, they deny it, but yet, that's kind of, as I understand it, sort of a Catholic version of a dominionist mandate sort of theology. I need to do more research on Opus Dei, but yeah, so you've got Bill Barr, he's another high-profile Catholic. We are going to be right back in a minute with the second half of my chat with Peter Montgomery of Right Wing Watch. If you'd like to follow Peter on Twitter, you can find him at Pete Mont, Petemont, and you can also follow Right Wing Watch on Twitter as well. By the way, you can follow me at Mindshift2018 if you'd like to DM me or message me with any questions, comments, thoughts about this episode or any other one. But I really hope you're enjoying this bonus episode as well as last week's one that I did with Andrew Whitehead, the author, along with Sam Perry of Taking America Back for God. I've been doing these bonus episodes because the news is breaking so quickly. And in fact, when I was talking to Peter just a few days ago, that was before the news broke, of course, that Donald Trump and many of his close supporters around him have contracted COVID-19. And that's interesting because, of course, as we're watching, especially the Christian right and this dominionist, the hyper-charismatic side of the dominionist piece of this whole puzzle, what is very informative is to look at their reactions, look at what they're saying on social media. I just had a quick look just this morning on Facebook. I looked at Franklin Graham's Facebook page, and he was saying, of course, let's pray for Donald Trump and Melania Trump and all those around him who have contracted the virus, and also that God's hand would be on him and on the nation. And so there's your Christian nationalist piece. And I was looking at Cindy Jacobs' Facebook page, and of course, she's one of these Seven Mountains Dominion theologians. We're going to get a little bit more into her and some of the people around her in the second half of this chat. But Cindy Jacobs was previewing that event on the mall that Peter and I will talk about in a bit called The Return, which was held in Washington, D.C. at the end of September. And she was going off about, again, praying for this nation and repenting of generational curses. And she quotes 2 Chronicles 7:14, which is a favorite verse of dominionists and those on the Christian right. It ties in Christian nationalism as we repent as a nation for these corporate sins that we've committed even generations ago that we may not even be aware of, that will somehow turn America back, or return actually America back into a covenant nation, and will be blessed by God again. So once you start to understand that's the language that they're using, and I would very much argue that it falls into Lifton's category of loaded language. This is straight into cult psychology, and they're going to get into magical thinking, and we see that all the time, and we're seeing that right now, especially as I say, Trump's being diagnosed with COVID-19. You'll see even more the magical thinking coming out of the evangelical support base for Trump, as well as these hyper-charismatic dominionist types. I just wanted to mention really quickly that because of all these bonus episodes, the one with Andrew and this one with Peter, I've had to push back a little bit my normal schedule on Fridays, but I am working on having this one drop with Matthew Taylor from the Still Unbelievable podcast. Hopefully I will get that edited down this week and released on Friday as normal. So that's a good chat coming up. I've also had a chat with Heath Brown. We went back and revisited this issue of Christian homeschooling, and specifically how the Christian right is using Christian homeschoolers, I should say, to advance their political agenda. So that's a really interesting one. It dovetails with the conversation that I had with Dr. Milton Gaither a few months ago. So that's coming up as well with Heath Brown. So some really good content heading your way. And in fact, speaking of guests, I've got some really fantastic guests dropping back in for our closed Mindshift podcast Zoom calls that we hold every month. We've got in just a few weeks Paul Kivel dropping in for our October Zoom call, and then in November we're going to do, in the first part of the month, we're going to have Peter Montgomery come back in, and then later on the 22nd, we're going to have Andrew Whitehead and Sam Perry of Taking America Back for God. So some really fantastic calls. We'll be doing 2 in the month of November, and that's going to be really important, of course, because both of those calls will have been after the election. So it is going to be very interesting to analyze whatever's left of America after the election. Speaking of Patreon, I just wanted to give a big shout out to Meg Hitchcock, as well as to another person. I don't know actually who this is, but their name on Patreon is DXY04120617ZXZX. So whoever that is, I don't know who you are, but thank you for being a new supporter of the show on Patreon along with Meg. It is greatly appreciated. All right, let's get on back into the conversation with Peter Montgomery as we continue to look at this piece of Christian nationalism, and then we're going to get into the real hyper-charismatic side of the dominionist support for Trump. And as we start to unpack their theology, if you don't know much about the Seven Mountains Mandate sort of crowd of dominionists, you might be surprised at just how bizarre this theology actually is. But these are the people who are in charge right now. They've got Trump's ears. So hopefully you'll find some information that will educate you as we finish the second half of this chat with Peter Montgomery. Well, you mentioned Christian nationalism. I was interested too because I was reading your article. You just came out with it as we're doing this recording. You wrote this article on September 28th about this rally in Washington, D.C. called The Return, and it was held at the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. And you said, it's interesting, you say, quote, organizers of the rally hope that a second Trump term and a right-wing dominated Supreme Court will help bring about a United States in which abortion is criminalized and treated as murder, LGBTQ people are denied legal equality and despised in culture as perverts, church-state separation has been dismantled, and public school students recite officially sanctioned prayers, and law and policy reflect the Mayflower Pilgrims' covenant with God to build a society dedicated to advancing the Christian faith, end quote. I mean, that's a lot of information in that sentence. Can you unpack that? Because that's the Christian nationalist piece and this sort of theocratic agenda that we're seeing, it seems like, with this religious right movement.
Yeah, a lot of the Christian nationalists, this is from self-described historian David Barton, who's an influential Republican operative. They have really focused on this, on the Mayflower Compact. And that when the Mayflower was supposed to go to Virginia, it got blown off course. It landed in Massachusetts. There was no government there waiting for them. So they created their own with this compact that the men on the ship signed together. And it said that they were there, their voyage was to, for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith. Well, there's none of that in the U.S. Constitution, of course. But to get around that fact, a whole bunch of these guys have now gone back and said that covenant with God that those, couple dozen people on the ship made is the foundation of our civilization. And so that covenant is still binding on us. So that all the secularism, all the, sexual revolution, the acceptance of LGBTQ people, all of that is falling away and is a betrayal of that covenant with God. And so all the rhetoric about taking back the country and returning to God there's also, that's very powerful political rhetoric, right? You white Christians, this is really meant to be your country. It was founded for you, and this increasing diversity and pluralism means that that's being taken away from you, and so you should rally to fight it. So in recent years, the most ubiquitous Bible verse at religious right political events, and you've heard it out of the mouth of Vice President Mike Pence and everybody else, the 2 Chronicles 7:14, which, the idea is if the church repents of its wickedness and turns from its sin, God will hear their prayers and will heal their land. And so that has been kind of the rallying cry that if we, the church, repent for all this wickedness of gay rights and abortion, then God will hear us and he will empower us to win the political victories that we need to reverse all that. And that has been really the thrust of, religious right conferences for years now. And it was the organizing premise of this day-long rally on the Mall on Saturday that all these leaders were going to repent on behalf of the church for letting all this happen. All this horrible stuff has happened because the church wasn't outspoken enough, was not aggressive enough in fighting the culture wars. And so that the church needs to repent. And if it does so, then God will turn things around and he'll help the church take America back and put God in prayer and Bible readings back in the schools and reverse Roe v. Wade and reverse marriage equality and bring back the idea that homosexuality is not something that should be accepted. All of this is how they want to transform the culture. And, as much as the polls are showing that Donald Trump is in trouble, they have been so triumphant during the Trump administration because he has, in fact, empowered them. He has filled not only the federal judiciary with judges, but, powerful policymaking positions throughout the federal agencies have been turned over to religious right activists. And so they've really had a chance to go as far as they could go in rolling things back. And they believe that getting the Supreme Court will be the final step in being able to turn this around. And that's why, it's interesting. Amy Coney Barrett, sort of charismatic Catholic, she's Catholic, but she's part of this charismatic group. But a lot of this dominionist of prophets and apostles crowd, people like Lou Engle, and they've been declaring that she is anointed by God. The way that they declared that Trump was anointed by God as Cyrus, they started declaring back in 2018 that Amy Coney Barrett, or even before that, people had prophetic dreams about her. And that, one of the right-wing legal activists went so far in 2018 when she was on the short list, but then Kavanaugh got the nod. Some of them were so pissed off because they were so sure that God had anointed Barrett that they called Kavanaugh a usurper for stepping in to take the seat away from God's anointed. So they have high hopes for her. They think she has been anointed to let them end abortion in America, which is really kind of their number one policy goal. And
It's huge.
yeah.
It's a major driver. As you say, the Christian nationalist piece, once you start understanding that that's how they're interpreting reality, as it were, through that lens, then everything, I think, starts to fall into place, doesn't it? You go, okay, I understand the drivers. I understand the motivation. Because I can remember when I was a kid growing up in Seattle in the 70s, we went to a concert. I believe it was held at the Seattle Center, and it was with Jimmy and Carol Owens, and they were really huge Christian contemporary music artists back in the 70s, and it was a nationwide tour they were doing, and it was called If My People.
There
and
you go.
I went to that as a kid. I remember going to that concert, and my parents took us all, and we went probably with our church group, and it was the whole thing. So that goes back to early, mid-1970s that they were saying, and that was their argument, was that the theme song of this concert / rally sort of thing was 2 Chronicles 7:14. And then I remember going to Bible college a few years later and studying the Old Testament and realizing that that whole thing was ripped completely out of historical context, because the context of that statement is, of course, in the text, God is speaking to the nation of Israel, who had a specific covenant sort of theocracy relationship. He's not talking to the church, but of course they've overlooked all that. It doesn't matter. It's the church God's talking to. He's talking to America, man. That's how it works.
Well, that's also interesting, because before I get off on that, that 2 Chronicles verse, it has become so associated with this Christian nationalism that a couple times that Pence has used it and has mixed it up, where he's mixed the language of 714 with language from the Pledge of Allegiance, for example. So it's just a very literal merging of those. But one of the things about Israel and ancient Israel being very different than modern United States of America is this guy Jonathan Cahn. So Jonathan Cahn is a Messianic rabbi, a Jew for Jesus, and he has sold millions and millions of books. He's got these best-selling series of end times books that purport to sort of find these astonishing parallels between a U.S. history and the history of ancient Israel in the Bible. He sort of draws these paradigms in these books. I find his books very hard to read, but he will tell you that everything that has unfolded in the United States has its parallel with what was going on with ancient Israel. And so that all those verses do apply to the U.S. because the U.S. is God's current covenant land. And so, even he has literally everything. Mark Twain's visit to the Middle East is somehow connected to this prophecy. The Clintons election, the death of Vincent Foster is foretold in the Bible. Everything down to the exact date that Trump was in Jerusalem announcing that our embassy was there. And Khan says that the 9/11 attacks on the U.S. were God's warning. That the Bible says that God would warn Israel when they had fallen away and they were worshiping false gods. He would warn them and he'd give them some time to repent. And so that was what 9/11 was, according to Jonathan Cahn. And because the U.S. did not fully repent, that now we are experiencing judgment. And COVID is part of that. And so re-electing Trump and returning and having this national return, national repentance for our national sins in return is our last chance to avoid the sort of catastrophic judgment of God on us as a nation. And he was the guy who called this event on the Mall on Saturday. Back in March, he called this return event, making a big deal that it was 40 days before the election, 40 being an important biblical number. It was actually 38 days before the election, but, it's all part of his shtick. And he's no fringe guy. Like I said, he sells millions of books. He's published and promoted by Charisma, which is the big media and publishing house for Pentecostal Christians. And they got, everybody from across. They got a lot of folks from movement elders like James Dobson and Pat Robertson to people like Cindy Jacobs as part of that.
I was just going to say, I'm looking at your article now, and it's like a rogues gallery of leading figures. And what you were talking about earlier about the overlap between the fundamentalist side and the charismatic side, because as you say, you've got guys from the Family Research Council, as well as these super charismatic and New Apostolic Reformation leaders all coming together for this event in Washington, D.C., And here's a quote from Pierre Bynum. He's the chaplain and national prayer director for the Family Research Council. I mean, this is straight Christian nationalism. He said, quote, "We've watched as prayer has been taken out of our schools. We've watched as Bible reading has been taken out of our schools. Where were we? What were we doing? What were we thinking? What did we do? They took the 10 Commandments off the walls. They legalized abortion. They legalized same-sex marriage, defying the living God." And it goes on. That's straight Christian nationalism, isn't it? That America has fallen from its once great path of this covenant status with God, but we've got to return the country back to God, that's the theme of that rally that they just held a few days ago as we're doing this recording anyway.
No, that's right. And it's, one of the reasons that they, and they see all this change, this progress toward greater religious pluralism and greater tolerance of diversity in all kinds of ways as a threat to this and taking away. And so that's why they have fixated on this idea that liberals are enemies of religious freedom. And that it's not enough that they have lost the culture war battle around, say, gay rights, but they say that, the LGBT movement wants to actually criminalize Christianity and shut down churches. And so, when Trump ran in 2016, he was still who he is now, right? So a lot of Christians were pretty skeptical about signing up with this amoral, corrupt
twice
guy.
Divorced, yeah.
But
all the rest of it, yeah.
Trump made this deal with their leaders, with all these religious right leaders. I will give you the Supreme Court you want. And so they went out and told all their followers over and over and over and over again in the months leading up to the election that if Hillary Clinton was elected and she got to name judges, that churches were going to be shut down in America. It was going to be the end of religious freedom. And that worked. It scared people and they turned them out. And that's why you see Trump now using this, he's not as nuanced. And so he says these clumsy things about, Biden's going to hurt God and that Biden's
hurt the Bible.
Right. But just the whole rhetoric that is out there in Christian right media is that this is the last stand for religious freedom, that if somehow Joe Biden takes over and the radical left in America gets into power, they're just going to shut down churches. So that fear-mongering is, a hugely important part of the Trump, re-election strategy, is convincing millions of Christians that they might not like him, they might think he's a jerk, they might all of that, but it doesn't matter because if you don't vote for him, some socialist is going to take over your town and shut down your church, and it seems ludicrous. And the public health restrictions around COVID, they've jumped on those as proof of this thesis, that they're telling churches that we can't meet. If we go along with this now, it's just going to be easier for them to shut us down for some other reason. So that's why there's so much resistance, to these public health restrictions, and kind of now this, whole martyrdom thesis among sort of powerful megachurch pastors who are defying restrictions and going to court to challenge them and getting the support of Barr and the DOJ.
Yeah, that's right. I was going to say John MacArthur. He recently was in the news just the other week, and he's a high profile. He's the president of Master's Seminary, pastor of a mega church in Southern California, and yet he was in the news for defying those public health bans on numbers of people in a closed room, no masks, and all the rest of it. And as you say, I've been watching those articles ever since the lockdown. There's that guy Tony Spell in Louisiana. He was in the news early on in the lockdown for refusing to stop holding services and not wearing masks and all the rest of it. And they're framing it as a constitutional attack, aren't they? They're saying, yes, this is religious persecution, but it's also a violation of our freedom of speech and constitutional rights and everything else. So they're tying it in with their legal sort of quote unquote rights as they see it. And it's an attack on freedom of speech, and they're muzzling us. And, and then of course they throw in there's all these conspiracy theories, a lot of the QAnon stuff. I mean, I've been doing a lot of research on how that's really become part and parcel of evangelicalism now. And you hear the word, they'll say deep state, and they'll say, kind of code words, and you go, okay, so this person's talking conspiracy theory level stuff, and they've just accepted it all now. It's all true. They're trying to bring Trump down, and that's all part of the pandemic, and on it goes. Yeah,
a couple of years ago, I went to a big event at the Trump Hotel here in D.C., put on by a few of these Dominionist apostles and prophets. It was Chuck Pierce and Lou Engle and Cindy Jacobs and Dutch Sheets, and this packed bar room with like 1,300 people for 3 days. A lot of it was praying against Trump's deep state enemies, calling down the angel armies against the people within the FBI and the Justice Department who were resisting, Trump carrying out his divine mandate, calling for God to knock off Supreme Court justices so Trump could replace them. That language about sweeping the courts for him and clearing vacancies for him, that has been over and over and over again the theme of events, mostly from the Pentecostal crowd. But, so again, they kind of all merged. There was a big, anti-choice event on the Mall that was, again, this Lou Engle and Cindy Jacobs and praying for God to remove justices. And it was also, had kind of mainstream anti-choice leaders. Marjorie Dannenfelser from the Susan B. Anthony list was a speaker. And so there's really one of the things that has happened. I think it started happening more quickly under Obama and then has completely accelerated under Trump, is the erasing of any kind of lines between what you might have once considered more a fringe part of the religious right and the more what you might consider the mainstream. It's all one thing now.
It's all blurring together. So you get a guy like Frank Amedia. We talked a little bit about him before, saying he's the guy who founded the POTUS Shield ministry or parachurch ministry, saying just the other day that essentially God killed Ruth Bader Ginsburg to clear the way. And I remember reading your article about this, and Amedia said something like it was a warning to other people who might stand in the way. He said something like, he's like a steamroller. He'll just roll over. You better watch your back. If he can go into these enemy camps, as you read these Old Testament stories and slaughter the enemy with his angel of death, hey, if you're standing in his way, watch out. He's an avenging, sort of vengeful God. And you think, God, but that's actually not that extreme. As you said, they've been talking this language for at least 3-4 years, if not more, certainly since Trump came to power, haven't they?
Yeah, particularly around Trump, because, he says, we've mentioned a couple of times POTUS Shield.
Yeah, what is POTUS Shield?
Right, so Frank Amedia said that Frank Amedia was early on in Trump's campaign, he was some kind of unpaid advisor. He had some funny title like Christian policy liaison or something. But he prophesied that Trump was going to win. He, said that God was anointed. And then he says that on the night of the election at 3 a.m, God told him he needed to create POTUS Shield. So he called up all his Dominionist Apostle and Prophets friends over the next day and got them all on board. And so POTUS, in his telling, does not just stand for President of the United States, that's the Secret Service acronym, but also for Prophetic Order of the United States, that God is going to use Trump to create this new prophetic order in the United States. And so, they've had gatherings, and Amedia is puts out videos and, denounces opposition to Trump as, in the spirit of Antichrist. So, yeah, it's all kind of, there's often been discussion on the right about politics as spiritual warfare. That's just on steroids now. It's all that politics is spiritual warfare. You have Paula White, who's a White House aide, shows up at the Trump rallies to denounce his opponents as demonic and call on God to take them down. We had a member of Congress at this rally on the Mall standing up and repeatedly citing this Old Testament verse, let God arise and his enemies be scattered. They really, the idea that everything that's happening in the U.S. right now, particularly in politics, it's all good and evil. It's spiritual warfare. Trump is the anointed avenging angel, if you will, of God's will. And anybody who opposes him is therefore, by definition, a satanic, demonic, antichrist, anti-God. And stepping back for a second, one of the dangerous things about that for the idea of a liberal democracy is that it makes it almost impossible to really work across the aisle or to, achieve compromise. If you see that everybody who's Trump's political opponent is literally an agent of Satan, how is that going to work out when you've got to, try to come to some consensus on policies that are going to advance the common good? It's a lot harder to do that if you've declared everything in these terms of stark spiritual warfare. But that's really
that's where we're at. But even then, this theology goes back decades, because I remember reading books by C. Peter Wagner and articles by Peter Wagner, and he talks about, 25, maybe 30 years ago even, the idea of territorial spirits and territorial demons. And you've got these demons who are in charge of regions and nations and areas and cities, and they're the ones who are sitting atop these cultural mountains, aren't they? So the job of the Christians as spiritual warriors is to pray and have these divine anointings and apostolic anointings to knock those demons off of those mountains so that we as Christians can be sitting on top. and be in charge of media and arts, entertainment and government and education and all the other mountains. So yeah, that's very deep seated, isn't it? In that theological system, it's all about naming and destroying and battling these territorial demons and dark forces. So it goes back certainly decades.
Yeah, and Lou Engle is one of these prominent dominionist anti-abortion activists. He talks about how influential, I can't remember the exact title, but a book from the 1940s of some person who was describing intercessory prayer as an atomic bomb, sort of God's nuclear weapon, at a time when that was a very visceral image, right? We just seen what an atomic bomb could do. So, so you hear, you hear him talking about that and even using that imagery out on the road these days. So yeah.
Well, Derek Prince. Have you come across Derek Prince Ministries? He's dead now, but he was a British preacher. He is cited by a lot of these new apostolic Reformation people as being one of the early forerunners, along with guys like Cunningham and Bill Bright and Wagner. He was prophesying that, there's this strong man over America, and part of that goes back to our treatment as Americans of Native Americans, and we have to repent of these generational sins, and it's all this whole theology of, if we don't get those things right that our forefathers did maybe centuries ago, that's somehow impacting us today as Americans. And so there's all this theology of these demons and spirits and all this stuff that's going on in this invisible realm, so yeah, wow, there's a lot to it.
You're right. There's a lot of that talk around these generational curses. And so
breaking the curses.
You hear this sort of like some of these prophets and apostles have over the years, created these events where they will get a black Christian on stage, the white Christian, and the white Christian sort of apologize on behalf of the country and the church for slavery and the sin of racism, that if they do that, I guess, enough or in the right way, that will lift the curse that we have because of that national sin.
And that's what's holding us back.
The thing you just mentioned about Native Americans, that was actually talked about on the Mall this weekend. That,
right.
I forget, there was some kind of congressional thing apparently, sort of a formal apology or making an apology for the way Native Americans were treated. But the person said that it has never come officially out of the mouth of the president, but they're working on that. So, so that they clearly think that that's one more assignment they have for Trump, is to sort of make this national apology on behalf of the church to Native Americans, and that will be one more thing that clears these spiritual obstacles to revival toward the third great awakening.
Right, it's holding us back. But we should probably end this thing. We're getting over an hour. I love talking about this kind of stuff. Obviously, you have a passion for it. We should do this again, I think, for sure. We've obviously got a lot in common, and I've read a lot of your works, and I'm fascinated by this topic as well. So thank you so much, Peter, for dropping in and spending some time chatting about all this stuff.
Thanks a lot for having me on. I look forward to talking with you some more.